Hello AP students, welcome back for another lecture on Unit 10. We're going to be discussing modules 56, 57, and 58. So we'll be looking at the humanistic developments of personality, trait perspectives on personality development, and lastly the socio-cognitive theories. So here are our learning targets. This is the content we're going to be discussing. So let's go ahead and dive into this unit. So looking at the trait perspective, this is also a response to the psychodynamic theorists, right? We're trying to now get a better description of what is measurable, what can we describe, what is objective, what is more empirical, right? And so you have the trait perspective, and Gordon Allport is one of the key founders of this perspective, in the sense that he's the one who defined what a trait is. So he defined it this way: a characteristic pattern of behavior to feel and act as assessed by self-reports and then peer reports, right? So let's say you're talking about these three categories here that he also developed in this theory. You got cardinal, central, secondary. Each trait that shows up in your personality falls under one of these categories, right? Under one of these levels, according to Allport. And so cardinal is that which is dominant. Okay, your dominant, pivotal roles that show in your personality. So for instance, the first example of a trait here is honesty. Okay, so Honest Abe, okay, an American president, the 16th president of the United States of America, and the 1860s. We still call him Honest Abe. You know, that nickname still stuck with him. Why? Obviously because that was a dominant trait in his personality. So central level, a central trait, it's still going to be of great influence, of large influence in terms of explaining the behaviors and developing your personality. And then you have secondary traits, and that's going to be exactly how it sounds: less influence, right? So it's going to show up in certain situations, right, but less often. It's secondary. Next we have Raymond Cattell, and Raymond Cattell used what's called the factor analysis, a statistical approach to describe correlated overarching variables, in this case traits, right? We talked about factor analysis in Unit 11 when you guys went through the intelligence unit. Factor analysis, so this was really important. You're actually using empirical evidence and trying to really objectify more empirically to make it more of a science. And so Raymond Cattell took what Gordon Allport did in his research and kind of simplified it, because Gordon Allport had over 4,500 different adjectives to explain personality, and that's a lot. I mean, that's a lot of adjectives. That's kind of confusing. 4,500, right? So he used factor analysis to take on these large groups to reduce them, right, down to about 171 terms. And then eventually that would lead to the fewer. He would actually get it down to 16 personality factor questionnaire, the 16 PFQ, okay, which is used to assess personalities. And so during his researches, he was using factor analysis to kind of simplify things, these overarching traits. He organized them into surface traits and then source traits, kind of like Gordon Allport with his three levels. Raymond Cattell had his two levels. He's got surface traits, source traits. So source traits are the underlying traits. So we were talking about submissiveness. So submissiveness would be a source trait. A surface trait is that which we see on the surface. Okay, it's the description, the observable description of the behavior. So if I see that you're being submissive, I would say, yeah, that kid just doesn't stand up for himself. He lets everybody walk all over him. He's not confident in who he is, right? So that would be the surface trait, because I'm using that on the surface to explain the underlying trait, and it's the fact that the child is submissive. Now, when looking at personality dimensions, Hans and Sybil Esnick simplified personality dimensions even further. They reduced it only to 2 dimensions, right? So you got Gordon Allport looking at 4,500 different adjectives, super confusing, a lot of overarching themes in these traits. And then Raymond Cattell comes in, brings it down to the 16 personality factor questionnaire, right? And then you have Hans and Sybil, and they bring it all the way down to 2 dimensions, okay, to explain genetic influences of our personality, right? So they were specifically focusing on the genetic influences of our personality. Now they, like Raymond Cattell, also used factor analysis to analyze these traits and understand these dimensions of personality. And they called them temperaments, right? Rather than necessarily traits, but they looked at these temperaments of personality. And so the first one is extroversion, introversion. Okay, the second one is emotional stability, instability, right? So extroversion, introversion, we're just looking at the amount of external stimuli we need to find fulfillment and to function, properly, right? So let's go ahead and look at some of the stigmas, right, of introversion, okay, that society has placed on personalities today. So what is introversion? Well, it's not shyness, that's for sure, okay? An introvert is just someone who seeks lower levels of stimulation, right? Introverts can have just as much fulfillment in their lives as an extrovert. I am an introvert, naturally. I enjoy being in a room by myself for hours and just reading a book. Just me, a book, and a cup of coffee. I'm good, man. Or sitting on my back porch back in Kansas and looking out at the prairies and there by myself. I love it, and I can just reflect on life and think about where I've grown and think goals and ambitions that I have and things that I want to do in life. And I love that. Like that's where I find energy. I don't need as much stimulation. However, I love being around people. I love people. I love gatherings. I love hanging out with my friends. I love spending time with my family. I like coming to class. I like our Zoom sessions that we've been doing in class. I enjoy that. I like seeing people, right? We have been so locked up in these past 4 weeks because of what's happening in Hong Kong and in the world with the coronavirus. I need some social interaction. So the Zoom sessions are kind of good for me at some stages. But so that's what an introvert is. Okay, it's not someone who's awkward and off-putting and antisocial. So that's kind of what the stigma has been portrayed as being an introvert, is like it's a weakness today, and you should be who you are. All right, you can find just as much fulfillment in being an introvert as you can in being an extrovert. However, that doesn't mean be a brown recluse and lock yourself in your bedroom and play video games all day. Like, no, you still need social gatherings. But also, if you're an extrovert, like, find some time, reflect, and get away, and also understand it's important to be by yourself sometimes to really grow as an individual. So that's what an introvert is. All right, let's now look here at the Myers-Briggs, the MBTI type indicator. Okay, so the MBTI was designed by Isabel Briggs and Catherine Briggs, and they wanted to describe personality differences through these categories, right? So you got like ITSJ, ISFJ, INFJ, and you've got all these different categories, these dimensions right here, like extroversion, introversion, thinking, feeling, perceiving, judging, okay, sensing, etc. And so all these different categories were actually influenced by Neo-Freudians, specifically Carl Jung, all right, and his 8 personality philosophy or theory, right, where he focused on feeling, intuition, sensing, thinking, extroversion, introversion. And so there's not a lot of empirical data behind this, behind the MBTI, yet a lot of times we relate with it and we think, oh, this really defines me so well. But scientifically speaking, the MBTI is not a great test for indicating your personality. So yes, there are some positives. It does help us with some self-reflection. It does help us understand ourselves a little better. It gives us kind of a starting point for seeing like the differences in personality and where we might kind of fall more so, and whatnot. But it's it's not very scientific, and it's misused a lot today. People use it for career advising. People use it for counseling, and in terms of like marriage counseling, looking at like, are you compatible or are you not compatible, things of this sort. For hiring purposes, managers might use it, but it's not good for that. It's actually, those are some negatives. Another thing is it's a very forced format, in the sense that if I score, 9 points towards extroversion, all right, and 11 points towards introversion, I'm gonna get introversion, right? Because that's the majority there. But if I answer 1 towards extroversion and 19 towards introversion, I'm still gonna get I, but I went from 1 to 9, and it's the same measurement. Like, so there's some inaccuracies with the MBTI in that sense too. It's a very forced format, and it categorizes you. And so, personally, I don't like it. Okay, next here we have the Big 5 factors. And this theory was developed by Paul Costa and Robert McCrae, in which they believed that the Esnick's personality model, right, or these 2 dimensions, was too narrow, looking only at extroversion, introversion, and emotional stability, instability, right, which on here would be seen as neurocentric. So they decided that was too narrow, and then Allport and especially Allport, but also Raymond Cattell's 16 PFQ questionnaire was too large, and so they came up with these 5 factors to explain personality, all right, more so on a continuum scale than a categorical scale seen in like the MBTI. And so you have consciousness, right, conscientious and agreeable, neurocentric, openness, and extroversion. So if we're talking about conscientious, right, this means you're usually prepared, you're usually paying attention to details, you have a schedule. Someone who's agreeable, who tends to score high on this continuum, would be somebody who takes time for others, is very helpful and interested in being there for other people. If you're neurocentric, right, you're going to be very moody if you score high on that. Okay, so you're going to be anxious, insecure, a lot of self-pity. Openness is the next one here. If you're openness, right, you spend a lot of time reflecting on things, you have a rich vocabulary, you have a wide variety of interests. And then somebody who is extroverted, sociable, fun-loving, affectionate, kind of seen as the life of the party. So these are the 5 factors. Now let's look at some popular questions related to this this theory. Okay, so first, how stable are these traits? How heritable are they? How about other cultures, right? When we're talking about these things, well, they're pretty stable. When we're talking about predispositions, we see about 50% or so is based on hereditary. And then when we look at other cultures, we see that they're pretty common from country to country across the globe. Same with emotions and facial expressions of these emotions, right? Same thing goes with personality traits. Very consistent amongst humans. Now, when we look at positives and negatives of this trait of the Big 5, major positive is that it's empirically derived, right? It was based off of the scientific method, and it's therefore much more accurate and can be used for more things than, per se, the MBTI, right? So this test is oftentimes used in hiring, right? For companies and businesses, they'll use the Big 5 personality test to see where you'll fit in their company, if you're good for their company, right? Do you have the proper personality traits to succeed there in their work environment? Okay, so it uses continuums rather than categories, which is great. If you're trying to see like personal growth or hire people, you can see where they fall on that scale of being someone who's introverted and extroverted, right? I can see, oh, well, when I was in high school, I was 70% extroverted, and then I'm just making this up, and then when I was 30 years old, I was like 62% extroverted. So I've kind of changed a little bit. I've gone more towards the middle than towards the outside. So that's another thing with continuums that is very useful. Negatives, it limits our variability of these traits. So, the way I behave in some contexts can be different than the way I behave in others, right? If I'm more comfortable in one situation, I may be more extrovert in that situation. So it could limit there. Another criticism is that it neglects some key personality dimensions like humor, right? You don't really see humor mentioned in this scale when we're talking about personalities. And you also don't see altruism, or well, you kind of do, but you don't see religiosity in there. So two other personality dimensions that really aren't mentioned in the big five. So that's where you do see some limitations. Now, another self-report assessment is the MMPI, the MMPI-2, and then you have the most recent version of this test. It's the MMPI-2RF, and that one was developed in 2008. So, and then the MMPI-2 is when I was born, I think it was 1989. Anyways, these are personal inventories, okay? So they're questionnaires on which we respond to these different items, and they're designed to give a wide range of where we fall in terms of these personality traits. And so the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory Test was originally designed for clinical purposes, right? So looking at emotional disorders, actually, and it had a scale in which it would measure you on which emotional disorder you fell under based on how you responded to these questions. So it was the original test was like a 500 question test. I think they've kind of narrowed it down some to 300 some questions. But basically, you're responding to yes or no questions, true or false questions, and while it was used originally for diagnoses of psychological disorders, it's now actually used for screening tests for possible jobs, right? So maybe if you want to be a police officer, or even going into looking at college careers or compatibility in relationships, this test is actually used for that purpose as well. It's rarely inexpensive. It's pretty objective and fairly accurate compared to really any other self-report test out there. So this is a pretty solid empirically based test. Of course, there are weaknesses with it, right? It's biased, right? It's a self-report assessment, so you could lie on it. You could be in a certain mood one day and a different mood another day, and answer differently to these questions. So of course, you can't do it. It's not going to be perfect, but of the self-report assessments out there in terms of personality inventories, this is a really solid empirically based assessment. All right, hello. This is actually a recording from a year later from the footage you were just watching a moment ago. But what we're going to be doing next class, now that you've looked at and studied these variety of different tests that are empirically derived, some more than others, to measure these traits that we use to define our personality. We're going to be looking at two of these personality tests in class, and we're going to have a guided activity that's going to walk you through basically your results that you get with these tests, and you're going to kind of compare and contrast two famous personality tests that are used. One of those being the MBTI, which most of you have probably already done at some point here at ICS, especially with Uni Advising. I know you guys do an activity with them regarding the MBTI. So for your homework assignment, before you come to class, please do this. All right? Please do not come to class without this finished. You're going to cut up 15 small slips of paper, and you're going to hand them out to a variety of different people: friends, family, coworkers, teachers, coaches, people that know you well, and even people that don't know you so well. And you're just going to have them write down, one trait that they think best represents you. Okay, and you can hand them like two pieces of paper if you would like, right? And some might be positive traits, some might be negative traits, you know, depending on your relationship with them. Okay, but when you come to class, you're going to analyze these 15 different slips that you've collected. Actually, recommend you look at them before you come to class. That way, you kind of have an idea of what these slips already said, and then you get into the analyzation questions more quickly. Okay, so you'll have time to do that, and you won't have additional homework. But yeah, that's what we're going to be doing next class. So please, please, please make sure you get these 15 small slips of paper collected. Bring them with you to class. Look them over before you come to class. If you don't have time to do that, then you can look them over when you get here to class. But class is going to be really short now, as we only have 50 minutes to actually meet in person. So that's it. Thanks for watching today, and I will see you guys soon.